Everything has to end sometime. Nothing can last forever. Whether it is around for a few years or a few days, there will always be a special place for everything. Everything has its place. There is also a reason why something is ending. Could it be because it wasn't popular enough that it can't keep going? Could it be because it ends on its own terms at the right place at the right time? Or maybe it's been going on for a long time to the point where it's dead, yet it keeps going. Or maybe it's just overexposure. There are reasons of when and why it ends, but what happens after it ends? There are those who are so good at what they do that when it ends, they are just lost, confused. They are looking for a direction to go to. What does one do when the whole thing is winding down? Do they keep going? Do they split apart? In terms of one group of musicians, they eventually did both. The year was 1995. Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain committed suicide a year earlier, signaling the end of grunge. Pop punk took over in terms of popularity. Many grunge acts changed their sound so they wouldn't be associated with the genre. With these reasons, grunge died fairly slowly due to the depressing outlook of it getting way too real, especially after Cobain's death. However, one band still hung on to the genre and released an album that is considered the last true grunge album. Alice in Chains were one of the big four in grunge, alongside Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden. Their style of grunge was more mixed with alternative metal, sludge metal, and doom metal, so naturally they were the darkest band out of the big four. And the studio albums that they released during the 90s part of their career got darker and darker. The band went from heavy metal mixed with grunge and some of the glam metal from earlier in the incarnation, to grunge and heavy metal, to grunge mixed in with doom metal and sludge metal. And this album is a representation of the dying moments of grunge. This comes from a band that were deteriorating from the inside, and the band did not end in the way that grunge did, where it was just dying, then dead. With Alice in Chains, it was slow and gradual, and then it rotted away for years and years after. The album represents what was good in grunge and what was insufferable with grunge, as well as some of the problems that the band's later albums would show. This album is somehow more depressing than Dirt, which had a lot of behind-the-scenes issues, with what it mostly being an album dedicated to Lane Staley's drug use. And the depressing tone of it didn't help things. By the time their self-titled album came along, things had become further depressing. To those who couldn't relate to some of the themes of Dirt, this album is a lot more personal, and it shows how far a band can go with a genre that was dying for a year, and perhaps the last nail in the coffin for a depressing genre. The album is arguably the last pure grunge album. Other albums may have grunge-like qualities, but this album is where grunge is gasping for air. The music world wanted to move on from that dreariness. That was why there were things like pop-punk, Britpop, and pop stars throughout the rest of the 90s. People wanted to dance their problems away, not be reminded of them. This was why this album stuck out like a sore thumb in the mid-90s. It would have made a home for itself in 1993, but in 2 years, the musical landscape drastically changed. Hell, even post-grunge, which was lurking a little bit in the 90s, changed. It went from angsty and angry to more soul-searching and got a lot more accessible than what grunge was. And that was why this album got the reception it did. Not to say that it was a bad album, but it just didn't hold up to the standard of Dirt, and that was because it was relentlessly depressing. This album deals with depression and isolation, and sure, those topics are dealt with in their previous outputs, but on this album, it feels really personal, as opposed to Dirt, which felt more broader. Most of Staley's lyrics deal with how he's so alone, with no one willing to help, and unwilling to get help with addiction, and he doesn't remember writing them because he was high. And it also makes mention to his former fiancée Demi Poirot, who would later die of a drug overdose, where he calls her out on leaving him for hypocritical reasons, those reasons probably being drugs. When I mentioned Lane's addiction before, it wasn't like an on and off thing. His heroin addiction was so bad that he could not possibly live without it, and it affected the relationship between his bandmates, who had struggles of their own. The future for this band was bleak even after grunge was on its last legs. To quote guitarist Jerry Cantrell, "There is a sadness to that record. It's the sound of a band falling apart. That was why there was no tour behind this album. That was why the album was how it is." And when the band drifted apart and the singer laid waste into addiction until his passing in 2002, there was nothing anyone could do with the band except let it go to the wayside. This album is a representation of bleakness and uncertainty. It's mournful, it's sad, it's distant, and it's the last chapter of an already bleak genre, right down to the title of the last track, Over Now. It was written as a breakup song, but it could be said that it's the demise of a great band, or the last breath of a genre. But, in a way, it is kind of a grief song. The song is a goodbye, a last sobering, bittersweet ending before a certain chapter has been closed. There will be many genres that will take influence, but this album will always represent the last chapter of a book, the final nail in the coffin of bleak, depressing grunge music, the last of its kind.